Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and my guest today is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And this is going to be part two of a two-part podcast series titled Alexander Technique and the Scientific Method. In our previous podcast, and Imogen's going to interview me for this one as well. In our previous podcast, we talked about the question of did Alexander himself uh, use the scientific method, and the answer was pretty much yeah. And in this interview, we're going to talk about how answer the question, perhaps, is the scientific method being used in Alexander Technique teaching today? And as I said, Imogen's going to interview me, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Imogen.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Glad to be
Well,
here
thanks
again.
for doing this again.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for volunteering.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's just start very briefly, and I would really recommend that people listen to part one first, although this will be its own entity.
Right.
But very briefly, what is the Alexander technique and what is the scientific method?
Right. Well, the Alexander technique, I would define it as a way of learning how to use your physical structure, your structure in general, as efficiently as possible, given its what it is and what the forces that are operating on it are on planet Earth. So making the best use of your body, or your body mind if you like, and making the best use of forces like gravity and support, atmospheric pressure, heat, light, etc.
Okay.
It's not about what you do particularly, it's about how you do whatever you've decided you want to do.
Exactly. And the scientific method?
Scientific method, well, we talked
In a nutshell.
a bit about that in the previous podcast, and I'll just repeat this little dictionary definition that's pretty good, actually. A method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. And it's something that I think a lot of people learn in high school science classes. It's an idealized version of what goes on in science, but it is as you said in the last podcast, it's kind of the gold standard of any scientific study.
hmm
It's got to conform to that and maybe some other things as well. Um, and as I said, I think we agreed that Alexander was using it as best he could at the
Yeah,
time,
more or less.
more
Yeah,
or
yeah.
less. And the question then is,
Yeah.
are Alexander teachers using it today, or are students taught how to use it?
Yeah, so maybe that's kind of two part.
Two
Are
parts.
teachers using it themselves, and
Mm,
are they using it in their teaching and enabling their students
to use it,
to kind
yeah,
of experiment and use
right.
it for themselves? Yeah.
Well, I should start by saying that Alexander died a long time ago, over 50 years ago, and most teachers today never met him. They were trained by people who may have been trained by people, and so on,
hmm
several generations back. And there are, of course, a lot more teachers today than there were when Alexander was alive. And there's really a huge variation from what I can see in how teachers teach. And to cite one extreme, which was the one I was initially exposed to as a student. My teacher did very little talking during a lesson. His English was somewhat iffy, and it was I would say about 90 to 95% just he used his hands to get me into a better relationship with myself, whatever. And it was remarkably effective in the sense that while I never for a long time I had no idea what he was doing, I didn't sense anything during a lesson. I certainly noticed things happening outside of lessons pretty much immediately, and they were dramatic. And I was
But
hooked.
you weren't experimenting, right? You weren't.
There was nothing to experiment
There was
with.
no. There was
There
no
were no. There were
scientific method involved on your part.
no. The main thing I did was he did have some things that we were told to do. One was never to cross our legs again, ever, when sitting. Always sit on a hard surface. He had special boards for that. And
Wow.
when you stood up or sat down, you would always tuck your chin down onto your chest so you wouldn't tighten your neck. And as a matter of
Wow.
fact, you can still see people. If you ride the subways of Toronto, you will occasionally see people doing this.
Uh-huh.
And and it does look weird. And it was an interesting moment when I arrived on the training course I went to and demonstrated it to the group.
Uh-huh.
But that's all by the by. I mean,
Sure.
essentially, there was no explanation. I did once ask him about directions because I'd read about them, and he said, "Oh, that's for advanced people or whatever." So there was no self experimentation of any kind. But
So that's the one extreme.
that's an extreme, and perhaps ultimately in reaction to that, all these years later, we're talking like 40 plus years later, I've kind of moved to the opposite extreme where I do use my hands for in-person students, but sparingly, and I tend to very much use directions and to teach people how to experiment with them. And I think there's all sorts of stuff in the middle. I think a lot of teachers do talk about observation, and most teachers have mirrors in their teaching studios, so they may ask a student to observe themselves in the mirror, perhaps while they're being given a lesson, so they can get some accurate feedback about what's going on. So that kind of moves a little into the objective, trying to be objective about what's happening arena. And I don't really know. I mean, I can't say what teachers use for themselves these days because I can't read their minds.
Sure.
My general sense is that most students many students, let's put it this way, are not actually empowered with a way to change themselves through thought.
Right.
Which is sad, I think.
To me, I love that, and I loved that empowering sense of that.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't really have any of that until I got to England, and
Right.
even then it was a little murky about what the thought should be, and there wasn't any real discussion of how to employ the thought. But before, so I think there's a lot of variation, and
Right.
I want to, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that in terms of this scientific method, and this applies to Alexander himself, because he was, when he was studying himself and coming up with his method, it was just him. So he was both investigating, and he was the person that was being investigated. So he was investigator
Right.
and investigatee, and that applies to our students if they're asking to experiment and sort of collect data, if you like, on what ways of thinking work and what don't,
Mm-hmm.
and or
Mm-hmm.
how that they are
They're in a
they are
weird
both.
position in
Yes,
terms of
yes.
experimenting.
So that's
And
quite a challenge, and
it's definitely a challenge, and that challenge may be one reason why um, some, maybe many, maybe most teachers have sort of given up on giving students experiments to use on their own because there are some inherent difficulties. And I want to talk about that whole question that you just brought up,
yeah.
the the scientific method, that idealized version that I read the definition of and that we talked about in the previous podcast, assumes that the person running the experiment, the scientist,
Hmm.
is not him or herself
Part of the
is
study,
not
right?
part of the experiment.
Yeah.
The ideal version, some guy sitting at a console and he's adjusting one parameter, and then he's measuring the results through some electronic device, or if a chemist is mixing a certain proportion of this and that, and this is what happened, and it happens over and over again. And the chemist is not really, or the scientist is not really, um, is not part of the process he's measuring. I mean,
Right.
he's adjusting things, but he's not in
He's not the
there.
thing
He's
being
not
measured.
influencing the atoms or the molecules and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, there's an example that in some ways is a little unrelated to the dilemma of an Alexander student trying to experiment, but it is an interesting one in that this idea of the neutral observer is totally missing these days in the field of studying subatomic particles. It turns out, and this is from the 30s actually, I
Mm-hmm.
think, that if you're measuring like where a subatomic particle is, and you get that down exactly, you have no idea of how fast it's moving. And if you know exactly how fast it's moving, you have no idea where it is, and various combinations. Now, none of
Oh.
this applies to kind of our real world experience, when we're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with objects. But in that field, the physicist is part of the experiment. It just has to be factored in.
Right.
And there is this famous thing called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is well established. It tells you exactly just how uncertain it's going to be. And
Okay.
it doesn't matter like for normal objects, but it matters big time for subatomic particles. So there's sort of one example where the classic scientific method seems to break down a bit.
Mm.
But I think when Alexander was conducting his experiments, and as I said, he was confronted with dealing with three things at the same time: what he was thinking, what his thought was about what
Mm-hmm.
he was going to do, what it felt like he did,
Mm-hmm.
and then what he observed in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said last time, he opted for the mirror as being the more accurate thing because it
Uh,
was
and I
unconditioned.
I would agree, but that's
But
still your interpretation of what you're seeing, isn't it?
oh, it could be. You could misinterpret what you see. I mean, you have to learn how to see those
Mm-hmm.
kind of things. But I think he was fundamentally correct in saying, geez, my feelings may
Yeah.
not be telling me and what's going on. And that's,
Right.
of course, the situation that Alexander teachers on their own and students on their own are confronted with all the time. That they feel
So, do
they're
you
doing
have?
one thing, and often it's pretty obvious to the teacher, and if the teacher wants to trot out a mirror or video recording, they can show the student that,
Mhm,
and students have the same reaction that Alexander did. What do I do with this?
mhm, mhm,
So, so but what I want to so there, and there are teachers who I think have kind of given up on encouraging their students to experiment, because it is to experiment in this kind of classic scientific way, because it's
mhm,
so tricky. But there have been some developments in recent years, and particularly in Alexander directing and directions,
mhm.
that make things a lot easier. And I'm thinking of things like, well, originally negative directions from Missy
Mhm.
Vinyard, and freedom directions from Jennifer Roy
Sure.
Cooley, and that are easy for a student to learn to do, potentially very easy for a
Mhm.
student to learn to do, but but they need to be, I think, for a student, if they want to be able to test them, they
Right.
have to be able, they can't walk around with mirrors everywhere, or be on camera 24/7.
Why not? No,
Why
I'm
not?
just
Well,
kidding.
I mean, you could be, but very few people are going to want to do that. So the question is, all right, so feelings, physical sensations are not necessarily accurate. That is, you may think something is one thing, but it might be something different. But on the other hand, there is something that most people are pretty good at detecting, which is differences in levels of tension, or
Mhm.
differences in, um, for example, if they're walking and they walk with one thought, they can hear the sound of their feet on the floor or feel the pressure of their feet on the ground. And then if they use a direction, they may notice that their feet are a little quieter and there's less pressure. They may notice, they can sense a difference in a kind of a downward pull that suddenly seems to appear when they throw the direction away, uh, as they go back into their old habit. So I think
So
you
you're
can take
kind of saying
advantage.
there's a way for them to
It's a way
um,
to get
collect a little bit of data
collect
on
some
what
data.
happens with, yeah.
And most people with a little training, and often very little training, like a minute's worth, are able to detect differences. And that can be taken advantage of um, by running little experiments where you use a direction, throw it away, bring it back. Um, and the directions that we have now available to us are so easy to, they're so simple and easy to use, that it's relatively easy for a lot of people to learn how to run these experiments in a pretty short period of time. Now, what
Hmm.
they have to, there are obstacles. There's the obstacle of trying to think the direction with some sort of effort, right?
Hmm.
There's the obstacle of thinking this is a crazy direction, and so that's what they're thinking about instead of the direction. There's the obstacle of they use a direction and things feel nice, and they immediately go to that nice feeling and want to replicate it. So there are definite traps, but they're
Hmm.
pretty, I think by this point a lot of teachers are pretty familiar with those traps and can talk their students
Hmm.
through them.
Hmm.
So for that, people doing that, I'd say that is kind of the scientific method being
Yeah,
applied.
in a very simple, practical
Very simple
way.
and
Yeah.
practical. And not only that, but because these new directions, uh, especially freedom directions, but some of the negative directions too, like so-called paradoxical directions, are so easy to use that students start sharing them with their friends and family, and can even help their friends and family get through these little pitfalls that we just been talking about. So it's not just our students that can employ the scientific method, if you like, but their friends and family as well. So I think the possibility is there. I think there's still a lot of teachers who have kind of rely on hands-on work primarily as their way of teaching, but there are other options.
I mean, and the hands-on while you're with your teacher can provide another mirror, if you like,
Absolutely.
another sort of, if
Right.
you're doing the experimenting, that gives you another source of data.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That can be a sort of a, but that's not going to be real helpful
That's
when you're on your own. That's the
absolute.
thing.
Yeah,
Right.
But when
Right.
you're in that situation, it's an added form of data collection.
Right.
I mean, it's many things, but that's one thing that it can help with,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that's the current state of things. I do think these new directions are gaining in popularity. So, excuse me, hopefully over
Well,
time there'll be more
for
use of
me, I
them.
just love some of these new ways of directing, but that's a whole other story. Um,
Right.
it occurs to me it's a slight switch
Hmm.
of direction in our discussion, um, but I'm thinking of the Alexander technique as a whole, and has the scientific method been used to verify, for instance, the usefulness of the Alexander technique in various
Hmm.
situations or applications?
Yes, and the answer is a resounding yes, and is historically, I'll be really brief about this. As far as I know, the first sort of semi-scientific investigation was done by Wilfrid Barlow when he was measuring the lengths of people's necks, and he
Right.
writes about it. And but more probably better known by a lot of people, the work of Frank Pierce Jones, using strobe photography to observe people as they, I think he was, a lot of it was getting in and out of a chair, before and after hands-on work, that sort of thing. And of course, since then, a lot of stuff. Maybe the most famous, the UK National Health Service back pain study, which was pretty solid evidence that the technique can help with that, and lots of other studies that have been coming out over the last 10 years or so. Um, and I'd like to especially mention the work of a neuroscientist and Alexander Technique teacher, Tim, I think his last name is
Cacciatore? Yep.
Cacciatore, who's an American. He has a PhD in neuroscience, but he's at the University of London, and he's run heaven knows how many experiments now, at least half a dozen, I think more, in which he's actually measuring postural tone and how Alexander lessons affect that. I should say most of the scientific study, almost all of the scientific studies, apart from his, are measuring things based on interviews with the people who were having lessons. Was your back pain better after lessons, that sort of thing. But what Tim has done, he's measuring an actual thing directly, and using a really interesting piece of equipment. And that's like very really precise measurements that don't rely on an individual self-reported
So
experiences.
it's removing even further from the investigatee having anything to say about it.
Right. The
Yeah,
investigatee
yeah,
it just puts himself in this machine and
yeah.
gets twisted around in a certain way, and it's measured. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think his work deserves a lot more attention than it's got. I think it's the most important research in our field in some ways. So, yeah, so
I'm
the answer is, generally speaking,
yes.
scientific studies confirm that the Alexander technique is useful for different things, depending on the study.
Yeah.
And
And wasn't there a study? I wish I had the information at my fingertips. Wasn't there a study done quite recently that actually somehow was measuring? It might have been postural tone, or the way it might not have been. It might have been the way people were walking, but when actually thinking different things. So it was
yes,
actually really kind of relating to what we were talking about and
right.
directing
Well,
before.
it wasn't measuring. So most of the experiments, there'll be some people who don't get lessons and some people who get some other modality and some
Mhm.
people who get Alexander lessons, and then you ask them questions afterwards about how things went, maybe a month
Mhm.
after or 2 months after. But this one you're talking about is people actually self-directing in the
Right.
moment and it
Yes.
affecting, yeah. And which is a really interesting study. And there's also one that just came out a couple of days ago about neck
Oh.
tension, done at the University of
Oh.
Idaho, I think, by
Oh, right.
Rajal, is that how it's
Oh,
pronounced?
Cohen.
Rajal
Yeah. Yeah.
Cohen,
Rajal
yeah.
Cohen.
So I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah.
and that is that's like Tim Cacciatore's in that it's not. I don't think she actually asked people stuff. She just measured stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So the
Yeah.
answer is yeah. The
Excellent. Yeah.
scientific method has been used repeatedly,
Hmm.
and especially over the last 10, 12 years. I mean,
Hmm.
and the number of studies keeps growing. Pretty definite confirmation that this work in whatever variety the students got it. They got different teachers have, as I said, have different ways of teaching. So, but it does seem as though the Alexander technique is pretty definitely a useful and effective process. So that's a nice
Yes.
thing.
It is a nice thing, and it's nice that it's not just me knowing it in myself.
Right,
There's
right,
actually other data to
right.
prove it. Yeah, yeah. So, is there anything else you want
I
to share on this
no,
subject?
I think I've said everything I wanted
Okay.
to say.
I had one thought just in
Hmm.
relation to our discussion on effective ways of thinking and directing, in that
Hmm.
you and I will be actually doing a workshop on that subject at the upcoming International Congress in Chicago.
Yes, we will.
So if you're interested in
Empowering your
that,
students. I think the
yeah,
title is something like empowering your
think for
students. Yeah,
themselves or think
yeah,
effectively,
yeah.
we
And
should make
I
people.
do, I really do believe that with this new, you could call it self-directing technology, um, people people can learn stuff incredibly fast that they can use themselves. I mean,
Yep.
like shockingly fast. And it's such a different process than I went through originally as a student when I first encountered the technique. So,
Yes.
okay, well, I will just want to thank Imogen Ragone for volunteering to uh, interview me for this podcast.
You're
She's
welcome.
thank you, and she's a teacher, Alexander teacher, website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. I'll be putting a link to her site by the interview, also a site, a page it's all about scientific and experiment. The all summarizes all the literature on scientific experiments about the technique and medical endorsements as well, and also a link to a site that'll tell you generally more about the technique and how to find a teacher. So, Imogen, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.